Alright, we're returning back here to Standard 9, the overall area or focus. The student will identify key issues relating to the course of the Civil War. I want to focus on these issues, the course of the Civil War. A lot of teachers, especially AP, I think you have to cover this. Talk about the advantages and disadvantages between the North and the South. Under executive leadership, government, war aims by both sides, location where the war was fought, and diplomatic recognition are 5 areas that are talked about a lot when we talk about disadvantages and advantages. Under executive leadership, the North definitely had an advantage in that Lincoln was a very good leader, both political and military. You know, he was a forceful commander-in-chief, spent a lot of his time in the war room where telegraph lines were going out to communicate with commanders. He was at the center of it, and he had this very effective military strategy that was created by Winfield Scott, the Anaconda Plan, and some of the nuances and specifics he was involved in waging the war and making sure that everything was carried out effectively. Alright, in the South, Jefferson Davis was not a good political leader. He was not a good military leader. He argued with his cabinet a lot, whereas Lincoln tried to get along with his as much as he could, be diplomatic. Jefferson Davis was not. Poor military leader, Jefferson Davis, and he wasn't a very effective military strategist and didn't really follow in detail what was going on. In government, we see the United States government, if you remember back when we created the United States Constitution, we saw weaknesses in a confederation. Well, the South had created a confederation government, just like the one in the Articles. And we see here that a stronger central government, like the United States, could compel its states to pay taxes or to send troops. So an advantage there was that the U.S. government could raise money or tell its states to send troops and money to help with the war effort. Whereas the South, independent states that had more power than the Confederacy refused to send money, refused to send troops. So the Confederacy, the structure of the government in the South, really showed to be a weakness on the South. And then war aims, the South was seeking independence, but in the North there was no consensus. One of the weaknesses there was that Lincoln wanted to preserve the Union. We went over that whole video on that with the Gettysburg Address, Second Inaugural Address, suspension of habeas corpus, and all that. But the abolitionists wanted more from Lincoln. They wanted him to end slavery in all the United States, to abolish slavery, and he wouldn't do it. We saw that in the Emancipation Proclamation. He only freed slaves in the South, and this shows how cunning and how intelligent and crafty Lincoln is, because he wanted to keep the border states from seceding and joining the South, and the abolitionists really couldn't understand his statesmanship there. In location, the South had an advantage in that it fought a defensive war on familiar territory. The people there are friendly, the population there was friendly to the South and unfriendly to the North. And also they had close lines of communication, being that they were in the South fighting the defensive war. But in the North, there was longer lines of communication, and they fought an expensive offensive war in unfamiliar territory with unfriendly population. And in diplomatic recognition, the United States already had diplomatic recognition internationally as an independent nation. But the South was seeking desperately for France and Great Britain, and they used their cotton production, hoping that during the Industrial Revolution, France and Great Britain needed a lot of cotton. But unfortunately, France and Great Britain had a surplus of cotton, so really didn't need it that great. And that we saw that after Lee's unsuccessful attempt to get Harrisonburg and separate Washington, D.C. from the North, in the Battle of Antietam, caused France and Great Britain to remain neutral. And then after the Emancipation Proclamation, because France and Great Britain didn't like slavery and had outlawed it in their countries, actually backed and gave favoritism to the North. So the South lost out there. So those are some advantages and disadvantages that are discussed about the Civil War, and issues about the Civil War is the North and South advantages and disadvantages. And we left a few out here, but we're going to talk about them. we want to get to the focus of 9F. We really don't have to learn this. We do. It's nice to know. It's not going to hurt you. Your brain's not going to explode or anything. But right here, 9F, explain the importance of the growing economic disparity between the North and the South through an examination of population, functioning railroads, and industrial output. So the Georgia standards kind of pinpoint and point at and give cues about what advantages and disadvantages they want us to know for the EOCT. And in this, they point out economic disparity is what we need to know between the North and the South. And specific economic disparities in the area of population and functioning railroads and industrial output. So the first thing we need to do is, what is disparity? That's a vocabulary word there that we need to know, is what disparity means, because the focus of our language of the standards here is economic disparity, and that's between the North and the South, northern states and southern states. So let's turn to this vocabulary and let's see if we can see what it is. Par is a Latin root word meaning equal. So this is a Latin word here. Here's the root word here, par. It means equal. Well, here now I'll give you three words here with par in it. Parity, there's the root here, means equality in amount, value, or status. That's what parity means. And you see the root equality here? Equality in amount, value, or status. With disparity is our word, okay? And it is the opposite of parity. It's because we have this prefix disparity, meaning that it's the opposite of parity. So we see inequality, but we see the root here still there, par, disparity. Inequality in age, rank, income, or treatment. And then we see another word, disparate. We still see this root here, disparate. So entirely dissimilar. So we see the prefix dis, okay, not equal, in other words. Disparate is entirely dissimilar. Disparity is our word, inequality in age, rank, income, or treatment. And in this case, we want to look at economic disparity. How unequal or unequal were the North and South as far as it comes to the economy. When it comes to the economy here, that's our focus. That's the focus of this standard, is economic disparity. And if we go back, we can read that over again. Explain the importance of growing economic disparity between the North and the South. So this word disparity is important. In the context here, we're going to use it as an economic disparity. And the definition is inequality in economic areas such as functioning railroad, miles of railroad, or working population, and an industrial output. And so characteristics are that the North dominated in a lot of these areas. The North had more miles of railroad. The North had more people, white people, that could work and be soldiers. The North had better manufacturing plants, more manufacturing plants. The North had more industrial workers. The North had more technology. The North had more exports. So the North dominated in all these areas. Railroads, working population, industrial output. That's what we're looking at here. And pretty much this is the reason why the South lost. You know, an essential question, we said, what reason did most people give for why the South was not able to win the American Civil War? Or why the South lost the American Civil War, if we wanted to make it more active. Okay, was not able to win as a passive voice the Civil War. But if we turn back to this, some examples of economic disparity, let's give one here. Functioning railroads. The North had 21,000 miles of functioning railroads during the Civil War, whereas the South, or conversely, the South had 9,000 miles of functioning railroad during the Civil War. So are they equal or unequal? And we know that disparity means, disparity, if we go back to our word here, inequality. So is there an inequality in railroads? And that's an example. Yes, because the North has more, has 21,000 miles of it, where the South has less, only 9,000, less than half. So in non-examples, we would use parity, or equality or equal amounts of something, which, you know, I think cattle was real close, but not really. The livestock available, but North still had more, but slightly more. But disparity would be if they had something equal to one another. I don't know what that is. I really don't have an example. But all right, so that's a non-example. But anyway, you get the idea of economic disparity and what it means, and what this word means: disparity, inequality in something. And here, economic inequality. So economic disparity is our element in the political interactions between the North and the South is a theme. And this question is, what was the reason the South lost? We see here is that there were great economic disparities with a lot of the advantages on the North side. In other words, because there were so many economic inequalities that the South could not compete with the North and could not endure a long and drawn out war. So eventually we knew, because of these economic differences, the South would eventually lose. Okay. So we have population here. What are the how are the North and South unequal, or what are the inequalities between the North and South, or what are the disparities between the North and South? In population, the North had 21.5 million people in 23 states, and the southern states only had 9 million people in 11 states. And furthermore, 1/3 of the people in the southern states were slaves, were not allowed to be in the military for a long period of time, or to work, for that matter, in factories. They were used to move stuff from here to there. Some things, and see, one of the reasons Abraham Lincoln emancipated slaves in the South was to hurt the Southern's workforce, these slaves, and to move the workforce from the South and weaken it further. All right, so number of factories: 110,100 factories in the northern states, whereas there were only 20,600 factories in the South. And then miles of railroad: 21,700 miles of railroad in the North, with only 9,000 miles of functioning railroads in the South. So all these are actually disadvantages of the South. I mean, it's getting its tail kicked. There's large and huge and wide-ranging inequalities between the North and the South, and the North is the leader in all these areas. Bank deposits: $207 million and $47 million in the South. So the North was wealthier. Cotton production, if we look down here, that the northern states had only 4,000 bales of cotton, but it had a diversity in crops. And crops, by what I mean by crops, is cotton is a cash crop. Diversity in crops is what about food items that the soldiers could eat and the people could eat during the war. So, and in the South, it's a disadvantage is that it had king cotton. In other words, cotton was king. That was a primary crop, and it was a cash crop, and they had 5 million bales. So they might have more bales, but it's still a disadvantage, because what about food items to feed the military and the citizens of the South? So that's pretty much a disadvantage, even though there's more being produced here, bales of cotton. All right, so we can look at different images. Here's one here: North and the South and Union and Confederate resources in 1860. 29% of the population was in the South, whereas 71% of the United States population was in the North. In railroad mileage, the North had 71% of railroads functioning, and the South only had 29%. In population, in manufacturing plants, the North had 86% of factories and plants that created things, and only 14% in the South, because it was primarily an agricultural area making cotton. And then industrial workers, 92% of the industrial workers were in the North, whereas only 8% were in the South. So these differences, this economic disparity, leaves the South at a disadvantage of being able to financially finance this war. It takes money to do this. It takes a population to put in the uniforms, and it takes creating things needed to take this war on. So we see that the South is at a disadvantage in all these. And looking at these statistics show us that the South was bound to lose. And if we look here, population affects troop strength, and we see here even all throughout the war that the North had more troop strength or more number of soldiers because of its population, and free population, might I add, of soldiers that were available to them, where the South had a meager amount or infinitesimal amount of troops to use because most of their people, 1/3, were enslaved Africans. So here is a big disadvantage to the South, was troop strength. And these are industrial output. I like to put these things in odds. What were the odds between these two? Factory production, 10-1 for the North. Textile goods produced, 14-1 for the North. Iron production, 15-1 for the North. Coal production, 38-1 for the North. Farm acreage, 3-1 for the North. Draft animals, 1.8-1 for the North. Livestock, 1.5-1 for the North. Wheat production, 4-1 for the North. So we see a lot of this is in the North's advantage. And I know that you guys like sports, so I'm putting this out here for you to show you the odds. Alright, so here's a different image here. A comparison of the North and the South in these things. Show pictures. You can learn from pictures. It's population of the South. Here it is in the North. Farm acreage, value of farm land, railway mileage, manufacturing establishments, workers and manufacturers, values of manufacturers, and capital stock and banks. You can pause this and look at this image. You may see it again on a test. I don't know. Just be aware of what this is showing you is economic disparity. Okay. And here's a map showing that if we look at the key up here, cotton in green, look at it stretched across the South here in the center of the Confederacy. Number one crop, king cotton. No diversity whatsoever. But see, we had corn in the North up here in the northern and in the border states. A lot of corn that you could eat. We see some sugar here over here around New Orleans, which they're going to lose that after the Battle of Vicksburg. And we see some rice in South Carolina and North Carolina. And we see a little bit of tobacco up in here. That was a cash crop, but not really something they could eat. But look at the industry up here in the North as compared to the South. The North dominated. And look at the other manufacturing places located in the North as opposed to the South. So these are economic disparities between the North and South. And in transportation, the odds were in railroad mileage 7-1, and naval tonnage 25-1, and merchant ship, that's the Navy that was used in the military to move troops and blockade. So the North had an advantage there. Merchant ship tonnage to move merchant goods, 9-1 for the North. So it's dominating in all these areas. Huge economic disparity. Let's look at this railroads. Look at this picture of these railroads in the United States. Wow. The South is a meager amount, 9,000 miles compared to all these in the North. 21,700 miles of railroad in the North. And another thing the North had was a telegraph lines going throughout the area to communicate back to the central hub, Washington, D.C., where Lincoln could communicate plans with one another. Alright. What was the Southern advantage then? So all those things were at the advantage of the North. So what was the Southern advantage? One advantage the South had, other than fighting on a defensive battle on familiar territory, was that it had better skilled generals. Its military leaders were better skilled and more experienced than those of the North, and the South had those at its disposal. And most of them come from military schools. So what are the traits of a good military leader? Is military knowledge. And a lot of the military leaders like Stonewall Jackson we talked about, Jeb Stuart with the cavalry, and Robert E. Lee had extensive knowledge in military because they all went to military institute and even were teaching at military institutes. So they knew all about battle tactics, forming battles, troop movements, and all this experience. Robert E. Lee fought in the Mexican-American War. So did Stonewall Jackson. And then Robert E. Lee, of course, tracked down John Brown as well. There's a lot of experience here in the Southern generals. So good decision making under pressure. We see that Lincoln was really frustrated with McClellan and had to remove him. And then another hallmark is courage, determination, and belief in the cause. Forming battle tactics, employing battle tactics, implementing those. The timing and placement of troops was important. And you also had to be brave and willing to take calculated risk and to be aggressive and move in places that you needed to be. And we see that in the South, that the South had better generals in that they could very effective in doing that. And we went over the transition from the chief commanders in the Union Army, and I did that for a reason, and we revisited here to show you that Abraham Lincoln went from Winfield Scott here, who was elderly, was very capable, but he was old. He fought in the War of 1812 all the way up to the Mexican War, and then started out this as chief commander of the Union Army in the Civil War, and even come up with the Anaconda Plan that eventually is a strategy that ends the war. But we see from inept leadership that the war lasted longer than it should have, with a transition to McClellan here, was not active enough. It was not aggressive enough to pursue Lee and to trap him to end the war quick, and Lincoln was frustrated with him. After the Emancipation Proclamation, the Battle of Antietam, or actually before the Battle of Antietam, because Lee was able to even get in Maryland near the capital, Abraham Lincoln removed McClellan and replaced him with General Henry Halleck. And then he replaced General Henry Halleck eventually with a very effective leader, Ulysses S. Grant, who used total war against the South in the Battle of Atlanta, Sherman's march to the sea to bring the war to an end. So there was a transition between all these leaders, old, and these two in the middle were very ineffective until we finally get U.S. Grant, who was an effective leader, and he showed all these as a good leader. But if we look at the South, the South had General Robert E. Lee was very effective as a military leader, and he's going to be the chief commander of the Confederate Army all the way through. Wasn't replaced. And given the resources and given the odds, he did a very good job maneuvering troops and escaping, being captured, cornered in, and finally just gives himself up to General Grant. Alright, so have we met our objective? Have we talked about or explained the importance of growing economic disparity between the North and South through an examination of population, functioning railroads, and industrial output? Let's not forget that language of the standards is very important for us. This is a standards-based classroom, so that's what we need to teach, and that's what we need to learn. Okay? If you have any questions, ask me in class. Raise your hand. Let's get that done. Good luck on the quiz and the test, and in the end, good luck on the EOCT.